In Greek legend, Eurydice was the wife of the musician Orpheus, who, trying to rescue her from death, failed in his deal with Hades and looked back, thus dooming her to the underworld. It is an ironic twist, her being lost right on the brink of salvation, a twist that was made all too real with the sinking of a ship named after her, HMS Eurydice. The sinking of the Eurydice is a tale of tragedy, a tale of mystery, and an enduring legend. And people today say that the ship sometimes may still be seen, like the woman of Greek legend, stuck in that thin veil between our world and the next. It is history that deserves to be remembered. HMS Eurydice, the second Royal Navy ship of the name, was designed by the Honorable Admiral Sir George Eliot, who had served through many of the most noted naval battles of the Napoleonic Wars. Ordered in 1841 and launched in 1843, the 26-gun, sixth-rate ship of the line was classified as a corvette. Although three-masted and fully rigged, she was relatively small. Captain Edmund Hope Burney wrote in 1878 that Eurydice was what used to be derisively termed a jackass frigate. She was the smallest class of frigate in the Navy and not much larger than the largest class of brigs. The Isle of Wight website Island Eye writes that the 921-ton, 26-gun HMS Eurydice set sail in 1843. She had a sleek wooden hull and a large sail area, making her a swift boat and one of the best in the Royal Navy. In fact, Eurydice was an experimental vessel. The Shipwreck Center and Maritime Museum of the Isle of Wight explains. Interestingly, the Portsmouth Dockyard considers the Eurydice to be an experimental ship, intended to evaluate to what extent sailing qualities could be attained with a reduction of 1/10 of its draft. The ship was reportedly fast and, interestingly, had a very shallow draft to operate in shallow waters. The Hampshire Advertiser wrote in July 1843 that the Royal Navy planned to make a squadron of experimental ships, including HMS Eurydice, that by sailing together set at rest the question that superiority, and give the government the opportunity of selecting the best ships upon whose lines hereafter to build others of similar classes. If such an experiment was carried out, the conclusion is not clear, but Eurydice served, apparently satisfactorily, in the West Indies and South Africa stations, including service during the Crimean War in the White Sea off the northwest coast of Russia, where several actions were carried out. By 1861, the Eurydice was listed, the Shipwreck Training Center writes, as a stationary, unrated training ship. But despite moving into an era where ships were iron-hulled, Eurydice found a new use. The Times reported in March of 1875. The Eurydice, 26 guns, an old sailing vessel belonging to the Chatham Ordinary, is ordered by the Lords of the Admiralty to be sent to Portsmouth Dockyard to be fitted out for use as a training ship for the Royal Navy. The vessel was formerly used for a similar purpose. Despite the advent of steam propulsion and iron hulls, the Admiralty was concerned that young sailors should continue to maintain traditional sailing skills. Moreover, they were concerned about the training system. The Times reported in April 1877. The Admiralty are about to take practical measures for improving the seamanship of our young sailors. At present, a boy having served a certain time on board a training ship is transferred to a flagship, where he becomes an ordinary seaman. He is then drafted to a seagoing ship and may, under favorable conditions, become an expert and efficient seaman, knowing the name and use of every rope on board and capable of turning his hands to anything that may be required in the severest weather. It may happen, however, that he is sent to a ram of the Rupert type or a mastless ship like the Devastation, where he can learn little or nothing of his profession, and as vessels of these classes are increasing and likely to increase, it is necessary that special measures should be taken to bestow a thorough sea training upon young seamen, so that they may find themselves at home, no matter what the character of the ships may be to which they are dispatched. A step in the right direction has been taken by the fitting out of the Eurydice, a sixth-rate wooden frigate of the old class, as a seagoing training ship for ordinary seamen. She was launched at Portsmouth on the 20th. The Eurydice was considered a good ship for the role. Her hull was sound, and she was, the Times explained, at one time considered one of the smartest and quickest 26-gun frigates in the service. The Times explained, before being drafted for service in seagoing ships, young ordinary seamen will undergo a 6 months practical training at sea on board the Eurydice, which is totally guiltless of machinery of any kind, and it cannot be doubted that the professional schooling which they thereby will receive will go far to improve the efficiency of our seamen and sailors. The ship was fitted out at the shipyard of Mr. John White. Verney explains that her 26 old-fashioned guns have been removed, and she carried 4 64-pounder guns of a modern pattern. Before she was put in commission, her stability was tested and found to be greatly improved since her last service. He writes that the officers for this ship were specially selected. Of the ship's captain, Marcus Augustus Stanley Hare, he notes, "From many applicants he was chosen, out of his turn, for this command, but even the disappointed ones admitted that a wise selection had been made, and that among the junior captains no fitter man could have been found for so desirable and responsible a command." He also mentions that the first lieutenant, Francis Hope Tabor, was an officer chosen with equal care. The special knowledge and experience he had gained while serving under one of our smartest captains, and the high professional reputation he's made for himself, at once marked him out as the best man that could be found for the most responsible post of first lieutenant of the Eurydice. The complement of officers and petty officers served as instructors, and the crew was rounded out with ordinary seamen under training. Werner writes, "During the summer of 1877, the Eurydice was constantly seen cruising in the British Channel, running through the Needles or passing through Spithead, always the picture of a man of war and handled in a seamanlike manner. In November, the ship left on a 3-month tour of the North America and West Indies station. On March 6, 1878, the ship set sail for home, at the end of what the Times described as a pleasant and successful cruise to the West Indies." Verney writes, "Eurydice, on March 6, left Bermuda to return home with her now well-trained crew, all in their early prime, the choicest flower of the British Navy. Eurydice was to them a name of hope and promise." The Cornwall West Briton reported that, in addition to her officers and crew, she had on board a number of officers and men whom she took on board at Bermuda, consisting of invalids, time-expired men, and prisoners. Those 22 supernumeraries included a captain of the Royal Engineers and a sergeant of the Royal Marines. The Island Eye reports that the Atlantic crossing on HMS Eurydice took only 16 days, down to the ship's expert seamanship. Verney writes that on Saturday, March 23rd, the ship was approaching home. The first business, he explains, when the watch came on deck at 4 o'clock, would be to bend cables. Bending the cables refers to the anchor chain, and the cables are stowed when the ship is at sea, and the anchors are closely stowed and lashed. They are thus out of the way, he writes. The rust does not stain the deck, and the bows of the ship are in some degree lighter and more buoyant. So when the ship is leaving land and the rattle of the cable is heard as it runs down into the locker, the sound tells that the ship is speeding out into the open sea, and when the well-known sound is heard of the cable being hauled up again on deck, we know we are nearing land and that the anchors are being cleared away. This is, of course, a welcome sound. If that noise awoke anyone at 4 o'clock that morning, he turned over and went to sleep again with pleasant dreams, for it was a sound that told him of home, not very far off. The next day, he speculated, when the Sunday morning dawned, the ship was passing Portland with a fine bracing northwesterly breeze, smooth water, and joyful life in every white-crested wave. With a fair wind, there was every prospect of anchoring that night at Spithead. The Island Eye reports she was moving fast under plain sail, studding sails on fore and main, bonnets, and skyscrapers. She sailed past the Isle of Wight on March 22nd at 3 p.m., as recorded by the Bonchurch Coast Guard Station. It was about 3:40 when she sailed across Sandown Bay. The men aboard HMS Eurydice were, however, sailing into dangerous weather. Verney writes that the captain was anxious to reach his anchorage before dark, for the already low barometer was still falling. Probably a southerly gale was brewing, and the fine northerly wind might chop round to southeast. Moreover, the ebb tide was making strong round St. Catherine's Point, and although the ship was bowling along through the water at the rate of 9 or 10 knots, she was not going more than 5 or 6 past the land. What Captain Hare did not see was the extent of the storm that was moving his direction, as was obscured by the cliffs so close to land. The Middleborough Northeastern Daily Gazette writes, "Yesterday morning, when people peering out of their room windows saw a violent snowstorm raging, they little thought that the unseasonable and unwelcome weather would cause a disaster, which would cast a gloom over the entire land. Persons who sat cozily by their firesides, watching the flakes of snow as the keen north wind hurled them against the panes, could have no idea that the curling billows, together with the aid of wild and angry Boreas, would this day commit to Davy Jones' locker, one of the Queen's warships, and some of her bravest men." Varney, an experienced ship captain, describes what would have been happening on the ship. "The first puff of the coming squall is seen, and the orders given to take in the royals, the topmost sails. The royal yard men are in the rigging on their way up to furl the sails when the captain calls them down. The squall is already increasing with dangerous rapidity, and at once the order is given to shorten sail. Already the studding sails are coming in when a terrific blast strikes the ship on the port bow, and without a moment's warning, throws her on her beam ends. A blinding snowstorm envelops the ship. The furious gale howls through the rigging, snaps off the mizzen topmast, rends to ribbons the now loosened sails, and lashes the ropes in 100 directions. The poor hull staggers and strains. The water rushes in through the lee main deck ports, along the lee gangway, and over the lee hammock netting. The men are washed away from their stations and carried overboard. The fore and main sheets are let go to ease her, and the captain's order is, if you can't let it go, cut it. The topsail halyards and the topsail sheets are let go. A gallant young sub-lieutenant rushes to the wheel and helps the steersman to put the helm hard up, and then he is seen no more. The sea is rushing down through the hatchways, and above the howling of the blast are heard the roaring of the escaping air and the confused cries of the men on the lower deck. And as the vessel fills, she slowly rights herself, gives a slight plunge forward, and sinks to the bottom, barely 5 minutes from the time the squall struck her. Because of the storm, no one saw exactly what happened. Of the accident itself, the Times merely said, Her Majesty's trading ship, Eurydice, capsized in a sudden squall off Dunnos, Isle of Wight, at 4:30 yesterday afternoon, and went down at once. A future statesman, just 3 years old, however, did witness the ship's passage, and recalled in a memoir later, One day when we were out on the cliffs near Ventnor, we saw a great splendid ship with all her sails set, passing the shore only a mile or two away. Then all of a sudden there were black clouds and wind and the first drops of a storm, and we just scrambled home without getting wet through. The Island Eye reports that at the time the Emma, a schooner commanded by Jenkins, and a fishing boat piloted by Mr. Coldut on its way back to Shanklin were the only other ships in the vicinity. Both raced to the rescue of the capsized ship, but the Times writes, The schooner Emma, which was passing, picked up 5 men, but some of these have since died. Cuttacombe, a first-class boy, and Fletcher were saved, and Tabor, the first lieutenant, but it is very doubtful whether he will recover. Tabor, however, the only one who may have been able to offer more insight as to what had happened moments before capsizing, didn't live through the night. Of all aboard, only 2, Benjamin Cuttaford, an able seaman from the Eurydice, and Sidney Fletcher, a seaman from HMS Rover who had been taking passage home, survived. The Daily Gazette mourns, the Eurydice, though she was in sight of England's chalky cliffs, was doomed never again to set on our shores those stout-hearted fellows who, in her long voyage, had doubtless tided her over many a storm, and steered her safely through many a difficulty. They who were anxious to gladden a mother's heart, and to send a thrill of pride through a father, by telling of the good impressions they had made upon their equals, and the favor that they had obtained from their superiors, and of extraordinary sights that they had witnessed in distant lands. Of the captain, Varney writes, We know but little more. Our last glimpse of the captain is standing in his sinking ship. For others there might be life-belts or boats or floating spars, but no thought of self could cross the captain's mind at such a time. The depth of that moment's sadness his brother officers alone can realize. But as he remembered his young wife and 2 baby daughters, he would commit them to God's mercy and to England's sympathy, while for himself he would know that his country's verdict would be that the captain of the Eurydice died striving to do his duty. The young boy who had seen the ship wrote, The next time I went out on those cliffs there was no splendid ship in full sail, but 3 black masts were pointed out to me, sticking out of the water in a stark way. The divers went down to bring up the corpses. I was told, and it made a scar on my mind, that some of the divers had fainted with terror at seeing the fish eating the bodies. I seem to have seen some of those corpses towed very slowly by boats on one sunny day. There were many people on the cliffs to watch, and we all took our hats off in sorrow. The event was so shocking that it struck in the mind of the boy, Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, so much so that he wrote about the experience in his memoir, My Early Life, 52 years later, in 1930. There were important questions. Should an experimental vessel have been used for a training ship? Why were its gun ports open, allowing water in when she capsized? The ship depended upon water for ballast, but much of the water would have been drunk by the end of the voyage. Was the ship unstable? A court of inquiry was held, considering all those issues. It found simply that the court are of the opinion that no blame is attributable to anyone. The ship was raised the same year with difficulty, although it was too damaged to repair and the ship was broken up. The Isle of Wight County Press wrote in 1997, No report was made, no follow-up action taken, and no lessons learnt. The Eurydice has since become a legend, a ghost ship seen frequently off the Isle of Wight, a full-masted ship that is seen clearly and disappears as it approaches. While generally written off as reflections in clouds, the Eurydice is one of many supposed ghost ships, haunting reminders of the dangers faced by mariners. Among those who claim to have seen it are Prince Edward, now the Duke of Edinburgh, who claimed to have seen the ship while filming for a TV series on the Isle of Wight in 1998. The film crew claimed to have filmed it, only to find that the tape had mysteriously jammed. Perhaps the most shocking part of the story of HMS Eurydice is how shocking it wasn't. When the capsizing was reported, it brought to mind to many people the sinking of HMS Captain, an ironclad that through faulty design had capsized in 1870 for a loss of 500. And Eurydice's replacement, HMS Atlanta, went missing with all hands off Bermuda in 1880. They are among the estimated more than 3 million shipwrecks that have occurred on the world's oceans, and yet their crews deserve to be remembered. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.